Hi everybody, this is Sean Bray from Diamond Hearts Art Studio. I have to do some resining tonight to coat one of our larger paintings in some epoxy resin. I'm going to show you the materials that I'll use for that and the process that I'll use for that. We'll be jumping around. Mixing resin is a slow process, takes about 5 minutes. So I'm not going to keep the camera on while I'm doing that, but I'll show you how I'm setting everything up. You see I have some gloves to protect my hands. I have some popsicle sticks, stir sticks, in order to stir up the resin. I have some hefty cups, solo cups, to use as my measuring cups. I have a mixing container, 2.5 quarts, for the large amount of resin that I'm making. I'm using the amazing clear cast epoxy resin, the Alumilite brand, amazing clear cast resin. That's our favorite resin to use to resin our paintings and also make some of our resin artwork. You can see that these have already been gotten into. I've already used the resin a little bit, but these are an AB resin, which means that you mix 1 to 1, the same amount of this one and the same amount of this one when you're making a resin. Takes 5 minutes to mix, and then you can work on it for about 30 minutes before it starts to get hard. While it's on the painting, before it gets hard, I'm going to pop the bubbles that I find with either a creme brulee torch, kitchen torch, or a spritz of isopropyl alcohol, 91% pure isopropyl alcohol. If you use the 70% isopropyl alcohol, that contains enough water to fog your resin stuff. So you want to make sure that you're getting as pure isopropyl alcohol as possible to pop your bubbles. So now we're going to start mixing. So I'm going to measure part A, and I know about how much I'm going to use. This is, I'm going to come up to the very top line, and I'm going to do 2 of each. So at this point, I'm going to scrape the measuring cup that I'm using, the solo cup that I'm using. But before I touch that, I'm going to put my gloves on so that I don't get any resin on my fingers. The other stuff is much thinner than this is and pours more quickly. Okay, now that I have my gloves on, I will scrape out this first measuring cup. Make sure all the resin that I poured into the cup gets into the mixture. All right, that's just about all of that. I'm going to do the same thing a second time and then move on to the other section of the resin. This is 2 solo cups, so 2 times 18 ounces, so 36 ounces of the first part of the resin. I'm also going to do 36 ounces of the second part of the resin, which is enough to cover a 2-foot by 4-foot painting and have enough left over to resin a couple of other things that we've been working on. So pendulum boards and a witch board that also needs to be resined. and hopefully this will be enough to get to those. So while this is sitting here, there are tiny bubbles that are coming to the surface and popping. And without mixing this one into that one, I can let it sit for a while and let some of the bubbles pop. And that will make it easier to work with very consistent resin with few bubbles in it, so I'm not introducing bubbles to the surface of my painting. So more bubbles coming up in this one. As long as I keep them separate, they're not going to cure together. It's only when you mix them that they start to harden and cure. If I pour down the side, I should get fewer bubbles. You can see that the second one is much runnier than the first one. So these are a mix ratio of 1 to 1. You want to get the measurements pretty much exact. The very first few times we worked with resin, we weren't very good at it. And I think we messed it up. Used maybe a little bit more of one than the other. Didn't stir them enough. Let them sit too long and they started to flash cure. That means that they heat up to almost 200 degrees inside the container that you're working with, which doesn't do anybody any good. All right, so now I have my resin in the mixing container. Both parts of my resin, the hardener and the resin, are in the mixing container, and I can start stirring. I'm only going to show you a couple seconds of the stirring because I want you to see I'm not going to go fast, which will create bubbles. We're not mixing cake batter and trying to introduce air to make it rise. Bubbles would be the enemy here. So I'm going to go fairly slowly, and I'm going to stir for 6 minutes. So I've stirred the resin for about 6 minutes. I've tried not to introduce any bubbles to the resin, but I haven't been entirely successful. As the resin is stirred and becomes one instead of two different pieces, you'll notice that the streaks from pulling your stick through the resin go away. You'll notice that it becomes more clear. When you are mixing the resin, you should make sure to scrape the sides to make sure that you get all of the different kinds of A and B off of the sides and into the mixture. And once you're sure that you have it all incorporated into a nice homogeneous single liquid instead of a mix of two, which I think we're at that point now, you can use it on your paintings. Now you see here I have a 2 foot by 4 foot painting that we did a couple of weeks ago, and I'm going to pour the resin on here and then spread it around with my gloved hands to make sure that I cover every inch. And that includes covering the sides of the painting. We also make sure that the sides are covered as well. So this is about half of what I had mixed. I'm going to try using this first and see how far it gets me, and then I'll be able to use the rest of it to get a little further. And we should have plenty to cover the surface and also the other things that I have left over that I need to use the resin on. Now what I'm trying to do is keep my hand sliding smoothly on top of the resin, pushing the resin. If it doesn't slide smoothly, I know I'm feeling canvas, and that's a part of the canvas that I have to cover with resin. The reason why I have this light, this big light, right here at the end of the table, which is probably not the best setup for making a video, but it is a good setup for looking for spots that weren't covered with resin or bubbles. So having the light at this steep angle allows me to see the bubbles in the light. This angle for the light is called an oblique angle, and that is set up there for a good reason. So you see about half the resin that I mixed, so that would be 1 cup of each, was enough to cover the surface of the 2x4 painting. I'm dragging my hand along the side with a very wet hand to make sure that I cover the sides with a good amount of resin as well. I know that this will drip, but at the moment I just need to make sure that it's covered. I can dip my fingers back in the bucket and use the wet fingers to cover the side, paying special attention to the corners to make sure that they don't stay under-covered or uncovered. I'm going to take a look at it from a steep angle to see if I have any points where I need to fix it. There are bubbles, of course, but I don't see any major spots that I've missed. So what I'll do at this point is take off my gloves that are now covered with the liquid. And I will spray this with the 91% isopropyl alcohol to see if I can pop any bubbles using that. Now what the isopropyl alcohol does is it makes the surface tension a little bit less strong, so that allows the bubbles to come to the surface. And because it's just a coating on the painting, it's not very deep. If we were doing a resin sculpture of some kind that's 2 to 3 inches thick, there wouldn't be a good chance for the bubbles to come to the surface. But because this is no more than 1/8 of an inch thick on any part of the painting, I feel confident in saying that the alcohol will pop most of the bubbles. So, unfortunately, there are some bubbles that will come to the surface over the next few minutes, and I'll have to use the alcohol again to pop those bubbles as well. I had prepared some tools in case I found some hairs. I would be able to take those hairs out of the painting using a pair of tweezers or an X-Acto knife, not to cut the painting. I'm not going to cut the painting, but I'm going to use the sharp tip of the X-Acto blade to lift any hairs out. I'm also trying to be as careful as I can not to sweat into the resin, but that is something I'm extra careful about. That would cause a divot in the resin, and nobody wants to see those, especially now that you know where they come from. Using the light at a deep or a steep oblique angle allows me to see that there are not many, if any, bubbles that I need to worry about at the moment. But there might be a hair. Let's see if I can get that. Right around there. Maybe not exact, but I can see it. So I'm going to use the sharp point of my X-Acto. Now I've created a little bit of a defect there in the surface, so what I can do is I can go back in and tilt the canvas a little and move the resin so that it covers those spots. It doesn't take much when the resin's very wet in order to get it to move. The longer you wait, the thicker the resin is going to be, and the less that little maneuver will work. All in all, I think I did pretty well. With the reflection of the light off of it, you can see the entirety of the painting. And I think that's going to be pretty beautiful. I'm going to move that over a little bit so I have some room to work over here for the other things that need to be resined, but I think that's going to be pretty successful. Very few bubbles that I can see, and no hairs that I can see. Wish us luck anyway. I'm hopeful that it's going to turn out okay.